Hi, and welcome back to our study group studying the history of philosophy without any gaps. Busy with the sub-series about India by Peter Adamson and someone Ganari. I forgot his first name now. My name is Nerdalliun Plebz, and with me today, Rogério Marques and Graham Pong. Welcome back, guys.
Nice to be here.
Oh, always great to have another session.
Yeah, I hope I got your surname closer to correct. Rogério, I've been calling you Marques.
It's great.
It's only been nearly 4 months. Get it,
It's okay.
get it right eventually.
Yeah, so today we're going to wrap up Chanakya and talk about Ashoka as well. Although it's just one episode of Peter Adamson's and Jordan Gneri's series on Indian philosophy. Ashoka has so much material to cover that sheds light on early Buddhism and also gives political and ethical overarching interpretation of early Buddhism that it's quite interesting to help us figure out Buddhism a bit better without so many removes as is so often with studies of even the earliest texts. So yeah, I think I hope everyone watching will find this interesting. So Chanakya and Ashoka. So just to be brief, Chanakya was the mentor of Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta. Then Chandragupta was succeeded by Bindasura, and Bindasura had many children from his harem, probably dozens, and Ashoka was one of them. And Ashoka ended up succeeding. So let's see how this goes. So let's just start with Chanakya and we will go from there. So Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, it comes in handy to know that this man has two names. So as we mentioned in the past session, so he's quite the polymath, a man of many talents, and a man that was quite on the angry side according to accounts, and he figured out, and he wasn't a very nice looking person also by all accounts, and so he ended up saying and valuing inner values, like virtues over looks. So not such a huge surprise there. And he figured out a way to get a worthy warrior to train him, to build him up during several years. And then this warrior ended up ruling. And so if the texts attributed to him, the Arthashastra, really are, at least in part, in the earliest form of the manuscript, attributed to Chanakya, probably Chanakya had some experience to draw from, and also he supposedly draws from other rivals, other sages who advised the rulers, and so he, by advising his protege in matters of tactics and war, so a bit of a Sun Tzu kind of guy. Also, he looked at different positions, so kind of Aristotelian. He advised underhanded techniques, so also kind of Machiavellian, but he was also a polymath, so a Da Vincian individual, as we've seen. And he, as for his Arthashastra, it means the advantage or success, and it's the art. So the art of the advantageous. And there were other political texts from ancient India. So ancient Indian philosophy is not just about the study of the self and cosmology, ontologies, and whatnot. and personal ethics. There were also political treatises and legal treatises, so like the laws of Manu, to give you guys an example. And so Chanakya probably drew from the sources that were available to him to also formulate his positions as kind of like a middle way or a middle ground between extreme positions, pretty much like we've seen Aristotle doing. And yeah,
something that was a little funny to me was Peter Adamson was just a little bit derisive of Aristotle, always trying to position himself as the reasonable person among extreme views. And when Chanakya does exactly the same thing, none of the same derision goes Chanakya's way. For some reason, it seems like Adamson doesn't like Aristotle very much.
Yeah, one aspect jumps out to me is he sounds very much, parallels to the West here, where he sounds similar to Aesop, where Aesop had started out as a slave, but ended up becoming free. He wasn't overly attractive as well. And also kind of almost the relationship between the Plato / Aristotle and Alexander with Ashoka, where it's almost like they're training the perfect leader / warrior with a philosopher. Those are parallels I noticed between East and West there, Tag.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are interesting.
Yeah, if we look at different periods of history and different geographies, these kinds of patterns will emerge. Power and wisdom, when they meet, the results can be fascinating, as we've seen between Aristotle and Alexander, and also Chanakya and Chandragupta. Innovation in terms of warfare, leadership, and governance can arise when this happens. Plato also tried it with Dionysius of Sicily, but Dionysius wasn't so receptive. So yeah, sometimes it mixes like like wine or something like that has been added some extra oomph or something like that, while sometimes it's like oil and water and doesn't mix. And so yeah, his book goes into many different aspects of ruling, from the discipline of the ruler himself, the removal of thorns, which might be adversaries, political adversaries, both inner and external, how to conduct things in the court, even trivial things like how to manage cattle and how to make more more butter or something like that. I found that amusing as well. So it goes from things that are really banal and trivial things of economy to overarching things of how to deal with powerful enemies, stratagems to capture a fortress, how to use spies. So it's quite an all-encompassing treatise that clearly makes people remind people who have read the Prince of Machiavelli to think that probably Chanakya in his own time and age arrived at some similar conclusions to the Florentian, if I'm remembering correctly, guy from Italy. So yeah.
He was definitely from Italy. I don't know if he was from Florence. I can't remember that little detail. If I recall correctly, The Prince is a very short little book. It's only like 100 pages, 120 pages. This seems like a more expansive, more comprehensive work than The Prince. So something that's also a little interesting is Peter Adamson mentions that this work seems to have been composed by several authors over different periods of time. and it has a slightly contradictory moral outlook. So in some places reads very moralistic and idealistic, and in other places very Machiavellian and sort of ruthless and without conscience. And one of the possibilities that Adamson speculates may have happened was that different authors kind of had different approaches when it comes to morality and governing. Although he also says it could have been that Chanakya kind of had some moral ideals, but then sort of just from a pragmatic realist point of view, knew that in order to effectively govern, you had to get your hands dirty sometimes. Or another possible interpretation was that he was mostly like amoral, immoral, and the moral elements of the book is just another part to like practically get governance going. It's good for the people to think of their rulers as moral and upstanding. So it's a little unclear the moral status, and it may be because or the moral stance. It may be because different people with different moral stances contributed to the book.
I'm even imagining Thomas Hobbes, if he knew the Chanakya, would just go, yes, that's it, that's right, rule them with might and an iron fist and whatnot. Maybe the differences of position of kind of ruling with ethical dictates or with underhanded techniques more akin to Machiavelli might have related to is this peacetime or is this wartime? Is everyone agreeable or is someone potentially a threat? And so maybe he would kind of switch between, like he's switching between tools, like we've just discussed. So if you see the environment changing, you stop being a fluffy rabbit and you start being the rabbit from the Holy Grail or something like that.
And I think relevant for interpreting Ashoka is that in what was very likely, at least indirectly, an influential teacher to Ashoka, treats religion as a social tool and a means for the ruler to achieve peace and prosperity in the kingdom. And the reason why I say that may be important for interpreting some of Ashoka's edicts is that, like, when he calls himself a lay Buddhist, that may not be entirely sincere. Like it's possible that was just part of a program of projecting a image of, shall we say, piety.
I can see that. I agree. Even Machiavelli was one to advise the prince to, the one thing that he must pretend at all times is to be pious, is pretend to be religious. And there were many other thinkers related to state and government, like Seneca as well, who was advisor to Nero. He would say that religion is a tool for the rulers, basically, as well. So the quote, the exact quote escapes me, the exact words, but he would say something like that as well. So people who are very, very close to power, they might see that the religious precepts of ethics, if someone were very close to the higher echelons of power and they literally executed all that without thinking, they would probably end up with a knife on their back sooner or later, or something like that, because things around the courts are not nice by any means. The courts attract the worst kinds of narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, schizophrenics of all kinds, the most deformed personalities of all types, and we can, just to give some examples, the courts from Louis XIV or the court of Henry XVIII are extremely well known to have a lot of underhanded things going around, and people backstabbing and betraying and whatnot, and a lot of deception, manipulation. And so if people are systematically doing these kinds of underhanded things in an environment, then people will quickly realize that outside of the sphere of power, to look well in the eyes of the people, you will project a visage of piety. While inside the sphere of power, the courts, you will do whatever it takes to survive, basically. And sometimes it's what takes to survive is literally removing thorns. So this might be the case. Maybe I'm also too influenced by Robert Greene's Laws of Power, who went into this a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of things that jump out to me is that when it comes to these ancient texts, it's pretty apparent that a lot of additional stuff got written in. It's like when they were copying it, sometimes a lot of scribes would say, "This is what they should have said instead," and or "This is what they should have said in addition" as well. And when it comes to the prince, yeah, that was short, but part of, I think, Machiavelli's point, if I remember right, is that was sort of a job application. Is he was trying to get like hired by the various, like the Medicis and other various, Italian city-state leaders and such. So
yeah, his target audience was clear.
So tag on those.
Yeah, and some of the sticky points where different schools disagree with each other are which of, say, a body of texts were added and which are authentic and were spoken by the original teacher of the school. And that remains a problem even sort of after the invention of, or after people started writing the things down, writing the teachings down. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Seems a little difficult to know which of the things were added on afterwards and which of the things are original. And then I think all people at all times basically draw on the things they learned from the people around them, and those things have traditions going back. So not only were these thinkers influenced by people who came before them, their teachings were influenced by people. The teachings attributed to them personally were influenced by people who came after them. So this is the case in like many traditions as well. It's usually the way people talk about, say, Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, where they say Lao Tzu is a name that people say is an author, but like really, we don't really know anything about Lao Tzu, and there's been several versions of the Tao Te Ching, and we don't know which is the original. So we don't know if there ever was a person Lao Tzu. There could have been, for all we know. Whatever the original manuscript was, we also don't know, and how that related to previous works, we don't know. Anyway, that's just how it goes with sort of ancient books. It's a long time before rigorous standards of referencing and cross-referencing were implemented. In fact, people still commit plagiarism and take credit for other people's work. Even today, it's just a little easier to catch them these days. It can be very difficult to settle the matter with ancient texts.
Yeah, the only tool here is the study of philology, where people compare styles of writing and whatnot. It's not foolproof, but it's it's the only idea that occurs me to try to make sense of this.
Yeah, I was going to say another aspect is you always have to wonder if what's written in the official book is even accurate or not. It says that those are people and they did those things, but do we know that? And again, when we're talking about things like Rome, when you have like Nero and Domitian and such with, when they get, their history is damned. They're stricken from history, and they're basically told to intentionally write to make them look bad. You almost can guarantee that what we're reading is not accurate. It's a distorted twist. So just wanted to throw that part in. Tag.
Yeah, it might be, but we need more sources if they are available. And for instance, the philosophy teachers shortly after Nero also badmouthed him in the lecture notes, the respective lecture notes that they took. And so I doubt that they also tampered with the lecture notes from Musonius Rufus and Epictetus, who were really scathing against Nero. So yeah, maybe the man was already bad, and they even layered on top even more slander. But he was by no means a Marcus Aurelius. So yeah, let's go forward with this Chanakya guy leading to Ashoka. So he really liked to think clearly, and he boiled things down to elements, to primary substances, like the 7 elements of rulership. So the ruler himself, the officials, rule territory, fortifications, treasury, allied states, and the danda or stick. So the use of muscle in the form of army or states to enforce laws, to punish transgressions to the law, and to deal with invaders, and even to deal with conquests. And he was also a man to separate learning into 4 branches. So Anviksiki, rational investigation; Trayi, religious canon made up of 3 Vedas. So kind of like the sources or reputable sources. Varta, science of material acquisition, like agriculture and trade. And Dandaniti, the political administration and government, literally ruled by the stick. And so, yeah, feel free to comment on this up to now. Otherwise, we have a quote there afterwards.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember. I don't think I can remember. Maybe if you still have your glossary of terms for terms that Peter Adamson considered maybe close to the meaning of philosophy. I think there was a term for rational argument, or like investigating by argument, and I can't remember what the term was. If it sounded a bit like Anvisiki, I can't remember.
Yeah, Anvisiki, critical inquiry or investigation.
All right.
I'll put it here in the comments. Yeah, there it is.
Yes. So is that the in your notes would be noted it was the preferred term by Ganari and Adamson for philosophy in ancient India?
Well, I don't remember it precisely, but it seems so. It seems that it was related to the conduct of philosophy.
I'll do a quick Control F in the text. How about that?
Yeah. If you have it at hand, yeah. The thing is, Control F with these terms that might have these diacritical marks. It might be tricky. And I didn't include diacritics here, but with diacritics. So with diacritics, I sent you in a DM. Maybe it's like that in the book as well. Full of diacritics.
Yeah, it is in the book. Yes. Also, they didn't write it like that. If they did write it,
anyway, he was systematizing basically sources of knowledge, basically an etymology here, and also conflating it with at the end Dandaniti with the means of ruler of enforcing power, basically. It seemed a bit like rationality, book learning, basically, and then a bit of empiricism. So what works materially, and these three sources would regulate how Dandaniti is conducted. Also, I remember at one point Adamson mentions about how should a ruler, in the opinion of Chanakya, get advice for ruling. So there were extreme positions like you should only get advice from your chosen specialists in a select group. And another extreme is you should get advice from everyone. Even a child might give you good advice. But then he'd say, in a very Aristotelian-esque way, that Chanakya would choose to compromise, a middle ground between these extremes. So kind of like still pursuing the most knowledgeable experts possible, getting advice from them, but still keeping a door open for sources of advice from the populace or something like that.
Makes sense. I think he'd almost find the middle ground in the middle ground. So, tag.
Yeah, so just to go back a step and settle that matter about Anviksiki. Yeah, in I think the first episode or the first chapter, Ganeri and Adamson actually do discuss Kautilya specifically and use his term Anviksiki as a method of rational investigation, and they also discuss some of these other things, other methods, and other methods added to the list of methods that people can use by others. So yeah, that rang a little bell, and it's because we've seen it before.
Yeah.
The first chapter was entirely overwhelming to me, like all the new names and things, and getting a summary. Actually, the first two chapters, I get a brief overview of all of Indian philosophy, and it was way too much. But I'm glad at least something.
Yeah. We're starting to make connections between the names and something of meaning to us. And so, yeah, even if it takes us to kind of say that this guy is kind of like Machiavelli or kind of like Aristotle, and if it makes sense to us and it helps us start to figure these things out, well, if it works, maybe it's not so stupid. And so here's the quote. So he would say, distinguishing with proper reasons between good and evil in the Vedic religion, between profit and loss in the domain of wealth generation, and between right policy and wrong policy in political administration, and determining the comparative validity and invalidity of all these disciplines in special circumstances. Anviksiki renders help to people, keeps their mind steady in woe and weal, and produces adroitness of understanding, speech, and action. Investigation has always been considered as a lamp for all branches of study, the means for all activities, and the support of all religious and social duties. So this one was a slide that I actually had waiting to show in the very first episode of India, but I didn't get to it, so I kept it for when we approached Chanakya to get into it. So yeah, he seemed like if this is really attributable to him, he seems to be a guy to not grab onto a doctrine or a system or axioms or something like that, and he's more fluid. So he even considers changing whatever tools he employs if in special circumstances. And he prizes rationality as a means to not always go by the book, and if things are different from the kind of scriptures or written rule book or whatnot, he urges rulers to think for themselves.
Yeah, from that quote, it looks like an appropriate English translation for Anvexiki would be something like reason.
Yeah.
It seems like a quite
I'm
philosophical
impressed
thing.
at how fluent Nerdalliun's getting in Sanskrit here.
Well, it's easy when you're translating one word at a time and you get a whole bunch of context like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm picking up some terms that I wasn't familiar with before.
It's also really interesting that the negation is basically the same as in Greek. The A is a negation at the beginning of the words, like words like Advaita, non-dualism, basically. So it's really interesting how these languages that are kind of cousins from the Proto-Indo-European, whatever it was, they conserve some semblance of common rules that might be recognizable. So he would also go into types of investigation or techniques of reasoning. So Samkhya, listening and enumeration, and of course it would involve listening to who, and then yoga, dividing and reconnecting, lokayata, empirical experimentation, and then extra added by other thinkers. So here we have what we were talking about, other people adding to the recipe, basically. Nyaya, procedure of observation and deduction. Mimamsa, technique for exegesis. So yeah, it's really
I think Samkhya is listing and enumeration, so making
listing and enumeration. Yeah. So again, it's very tempting to compare notes from Chanakya with notes from Aristotle, looking at these.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen yoga used in this way. So basically, analysis and synthesis as a method of inquiry. I've never heard yoga meant to refer to that.
Yeah, it looks like classification and showing the connections between the classified items.
So was Aristotle very fond of doing yoga then?
Yeah. And so this is all I had for Chanakya, and it's also worthy to mention how he probably influenced Ashoka, who we will see, according to accounts, had two phases in his career as a ruler. And so, yeah, any last words on Chanakya? Otherwise, we'll go forward to Ashoka.
I'm happy to leave Chanakya, aka Kautilya, alone for now.
Okay.
I was going to say one last thought that I had there was, given his the time he lived, he's almost like starting about halfway in between Ashoka and the Buddha. And I just find that kind of interesting to see, just how much of it he still contained some of that original sensibility. And again, he seems like, what a man after one of my sayings, which is everything in moderation, including moderation. Sometimes you got to throw moderation out the window. Tagging on that one and ready to move on. Chandragupta next, I believe.
Yeah, well, we didn't really get into Chandragupta and Bindasura, but I've mentioned them so as to not show how Chanakya kind of mentors Chandragupta, and Ashoka probably never met Chanakya chronologically, and so might have been influenced at least one remove from him. Maybe studied his material as book learning. I knew of a series done in India representing these characters, a kind of history channel kind of thing. And people were criticizing because they showed that Chanakya was still alive in Ashoka's time, which some scholars are certain that it was not the case. But anyway, probably he influenced Ashoka. So Ashoka, here is a depiction I managed to conjure up with Midjourney. Probably inspired by the reliefs in the Buddhist stupas or whatnot. And so this Ashoka fellow, he lived in a time after Alexander the Great had died, and was contemporary of some of the successors in the different kingdoms left by Alexander the Great. Also, he probably, according to Adamson, experienced the power vacuum left by after Alexander's death in the regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan, especially. So he was the son of Bindusara, as I mentioned, grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. Ruled almost all of the Indian subcontinent. So he didn't just inherit a really big kingdom from Bindusara, but he also expanded it substantially through conquest. So early in life, he was referred to as Chanda Ashoka, or Ashoka the Ferocious, or Ashoka the Cruel. However, after becoming Buddhist, he became known as Dharma Ashoka. And one of the favorite quotes I have from him is, "No society can prosper if it aims at making things easier. Instead, it should aim at making people stronger." And this, in our modern age, it hits us like a train when so much of our technological progress is aimed at making our lives easier, and we have no philosophical or almost no philosophical tradition to temper that with urging us to keep kind of sweating in peacetime, so that we may avoid bleeding in times of crisis or wartime. And so this is a really I think essential piece of advice, and the legacy that he left. So he started with three minor rock edicts, and then expanded to, when he became maybe even more powerful or more influential or more ambitious, he expanded to 14 major rock edicts, and mostly written in the language of his empire, Prakriti, with ethical and political significance, but also some of the edicts in the region of Pakistan and Afghanistan, also written in Greek and Aramaic, which is really, really interesting. So any thoughts on the surface presentation of this fellow?
Yeah, just briefly a thought about our current society and making people stronger. There are people like David Goggins running around saying, like, push your limits, and Jocko Willink and the
Yeah,
like.
yeah.
So there are influencers that push for that. But yeah, like there's, I think we are spoiled for ways to make life easy. It's very easy to get spoiled in a society like that. About Ashoka, I was just having a quick look at the region. So you highlighted Pataliputra there, which is like all the way on the east side of India, and I think Kautilya was closer to Pakistan's side. Is that correct?
Yep.
So was that just their hometowns, or is that where they
these
set up shop?
These are the hometowns. Yeah, the places of birth, according to what I could figure out through a brief internet research. So supposedly Ashoka was born in the Ganges river basin near. So Pataliputra is a town or a city located near the Ganges or Ganga river, as the Indians like to call it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting to me. I'm curious, like where the palaces were, where they would have ruled, or like maybe the influence from Kautilya would have been quite indirect, or like I'm not sure how much they would be moving around. It does make sense that he identified it as a Buddhist, though, because I think the Buddhists were more influential on the northeastern areas of India than they were other areas. Might be mistaken about that, but that's the kind of impression I had.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for the modern sensibility to wrap their head around the idea of Buddhists being warlike. And, Ashoka. Well, Ashoka is one of the reasons why it's so hard for him, because the way he reacted to it and his change in the middle of life. And that's what makes him such a fascinating character. Is, it's, the stage A, stage B of his life sort of thing. And, yeah. No, so and again, I kind of wonder how much of him was a reaction to Aristotle having come over there. Like you said, is he definitely took advantage of the power vacuum that was left behind.
Yeah, Alexander, you mean Alexander, not Aristotle.
Yeah, my bad, misspoke.
Yeah. Supposedly, his grandfather even met Alexander the Great in person, though it was said without a lot of conviction by Peter Adamson. And so, but they probably knew about his existence, and as we will see, Ashoka clearly knew about the successors of Alexander. Also, one of the slides I will show has a map that also shows not just the location of the edicts, but also cities in his empire. So maybe it might shed some light on your question, Nerdalliun, as well. Yeah, and so he started his career as a ruler with the names, the surname, or rather the pseudonym Shandashoka, Ashoka the Cruel, or Ashoka the Ferocious. And so why? Because among many other things, fratricidal, had 99 brothers killed to eliminate challenge for the throne. Uxoricidal, which means he killed his wives or harem girls by him learning that they were mocking his ugliness or his physical appearance. Also, he was known as quite a sadistic kind of guy who built a torture chamber with the outer appearance of a lavish palace that would attract naturally curious, gullible, greedy people to enter it. And he employed in that torture palace supposedly a very malicious and wicked, sadistic man, expert in all forms of torture. And the chamber inside it had torture chambers inspired in the 5 tortures of the Buddhist hell. So not a nice place. It was referred to as the beautiful Gaol. So when I started to learn about Ashoka, when I was learning about Buddhism way before this podcast even met my ears, I learned about Ashoka as Ashoka the Great. And then afterwards, in the middle of my study, to my shock, I learned that this guy was a sadistic tyrant, mass murderer, genocidal guy, supposedly by these accounts, before he kind of changed. And so the change supposedly happened by his experience in one of his conquests, a conquest that was substantially bloodier than the others, and perhaps maybe 500,000 people died or were dislocated from their homes due to this war, and he supposedly realized that this was unsustainable, this was terrible. Maybe he confronted with the suffering at a deeper personal level of the people afflicted by the war, like commoners or something like that. So we don't know for sure, but the legend is that he turned, he changed with this conquest, with this realization. It was his last conquest, and then he started to learn from Buddhist monks. He did several pilgrimage that were, although they were immortalized in two places, in these rock edicts that he commissioned, and also in Buddhist texts. So they more or less tell the same story. So for all accounts, maybe there is some historicity to it. And so yeah, this is a photo of one of his rock edicts, and so he became known as the Shock of the West. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to make clear, I think there's nowhere in the rock edicts tales about him murdering his brothers or his harem or building torture chambers. The sources for those are Buddhist legends, where we can easily imagine may have had an agenda to exaggerate just how cruel and bad he was before converting to Buddhism. I don't think there's any direct evidence in any of the rock edicts that he ever converted to Buddhism. There are edicts where he identifies as a lay Buddhist, but like the closest we get to a before and after is just a statement of him saying he feels regret or remorse for the killing that happened during a conquest, which it isn't exactly proof of a dramatic conversion. It's just there was the worst of the wars he fought. He put in the edicts that he regrets all the slaughter and killing that happened in those wars, and yeah, you can spin a story around that, but it's not exactly.
Yeah, a lot of possibilities for what might have actually happened. So it might have been sincere. It might be a PR kind of move, and also the Buddhists might be sincere, or they might be kind of exaggerating the before and after. So it's maybe it would be easier to be sure with further study, with study of different sources that don't have all the same agenda or something like that.
Yeah, I think the Buddhists probably got a lot out of Ashoka identifying as a Buddhist and putting that in the rock edict, so that for at least the time while there could still be read, there was strong evidence of sort of the moral approval of a leader that was considered to be a great leader. Yeah, I just think what I know of say human nature generally is that like really cruel sociopaths usually don't suddenly get a conscience like halfway through life and find any kind of religious conversion and become like great, loving, kind, and moral, upstanding people in a dramatic way. I don't think that can happen. I'm not saying that's impossible. That just usually doesn't happen. So that story strikes me as unlikely and sort of self-serving of Buddhists to perpetuate that legend. So a little skeptical of that whole story.
You sound cynical of how prisoners might possibly be reformed from their crimes. Just saying. No, I was going to say that again. This is the. It sounds like Ashoka is one part, Vlad the Impaler, one part,
Yeah.
one part Constantine, where it's the, do I really convert to this religion I'm promoting, or do I not? And then one point, it's definitely a very strange, odd mix, and yeah, definitely interesting. Tag.
And so yeah, to talk about his second phase. So supposedly he commissioned the building of 84,000 stupas, which are Buddhist burial mounds. Peter Adamson mentioned that this number was supposedly matching the traditional number of atoms in the human body or something like that. Also, supposedly the stupas were places to hold relics of either the early founders of Buddhism. So not just Siddhartha, but others. And so, he set an example for the generosity of other rulers. I meant rulers, not scholars. Other rulers after Ashoka, maybe even contemporaries of his from the Hellenistic world, might have gotten examples from him. And so, yeah, his edicts are really the most visible part that for many centuries were unknown, and people did not know what was behind them, what kind of story or ruler was behind them, and then they were translated, if not in the 19th century, maybe in the 18th century, but not a long time ago. And yeah, he was known for giving away all his wealth, but although this might be also Buddhist legend, it's kind of exaggerating. He ruled for, I think, 40 years or something like that, and then after he died, there was no clear or proper succession, and so then the empire didn't last after that. That's more or less the same problem that happened with Marcus Aurelius, although not with the dramatic consequences of immediate dissolution of the Roman Empire. But he, like Ashoka's descendants, were no match to supposedly his competence as a ruler. Also, Marcus Aurelius' son was also quite rubbish as a ruler, according to the accounts. And there is in more examples in history. If I would challenge anyone who is knowledgeable in history to find a competent leader with a son to match, a biological son as a successor to match, that would at least keep things well, it's a very difficult proposition to find. Often dynasties don't go really well. Then, so here is even a representation of Ashoka attending a Buddhist council. And so, as I mentioned, most edicts were written in Prakrit language, which have these characters that you see. So they're different from the Sanskrit, which has always the line on the top. And these are different characters, alien to us, basically. Supposedly more related to kind of Tamil language. And here is one that has Greek characters. So we can see sigmas and alphas and whatnot, and lambdas all over the place, which probably was really interesting for people to discover and start to compare the inscriptions in these ones in Greek with the other ones in Prakrit and so forth. I'll try to figure out if this was a kind of a Rosetta Stone moment to figure out Prakrit, but I couldn't find any conclusion. But either through through comparison between Greek and Prakrit, or from some other means, someone figured out how to read Prakrit in the last 200 years or so. And here are the locations. Go ahead, Graham. It's just to show the locations.
I was just going to comment on that father to son leader thing. I was curious if you guys were going to let me get away with George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush as an example. Peg.
George W. Bush, well renowned for his
W.
W.
he held it together after 9/11. You know.
Yeah.
Just noting that example and moving on.
Yes. So the major city of Pataliputra, which I think was the city that I mentioned in his birthplace, capital of the kingdom, and then we have other two capitals, so Sanchi, and then a capital to the north, Arkandum, which were the three major cities that we can see here. And then the brownish and yellowish spheres and pillar-shaped icons are the rock and pillar edicts locations. So a lot of ground here covered by the empire, and these edicts, they were made to last, which is something different from our time. They don't make edicts like then.
Obviously, they didn't leave in room to amend their laws and shit. So,
yeah, exactly. They probably were really sure of themselves when the time came to put chisel to the stone. So maybe they had manuscripts that they revised quite a bit, and when they were happy with them, they printed it in, so to speak, to the stone. They were mediums of writing in palm tree leaves and whatnot that they would fashion in a similar way as Egyptians used their papyrus. And so there might have been written records earlier than we think, but they just didn't survive. So the archaeologists and historians really don't have anything tangible to work with, because these things degrade with time.
Yeah, I think in the case of Buddhism specifically, there are accounts in the earliest written records of the earliest transmission of the ideas, and so the earliest written accounts of Buddhism, I think, point to oral transmission of ideas, the early teachings.
But I don't buy that a lot, because it's like the stories are pointing at, while the Buddha was alive, he said, don't write my lectures, please. Just respect that. And then as soon as he died, Ananda or something, his attendant, asked him, so after you die, we can write it down? And he said, yeah, after I die, you can write it down. So it's almost impossible to conceive that these precious things that he said, they weren't just writing it down from memory as soon as their master died. I think they would do that. I would do that in that situation. Yeah, imagine someone told me something really, really extremely wise, at least in my perception, and then he asks me not to write it. And then he suddenly dies, so I would try to write it down to preserve. So what I think is, yeah, probably there were oral traditions related to the Upanishads and whatnot, and also the Upanishads per se were very esoteric kinds of wisdom. They weren't like distributing them to the commoners outside of the Brahmin circles. While Buddhism, they really wanted to kind of spread the word, because everyone was involved in this dukkha thing. Dukkha is something that unites us all. Everyone experiences dukkha according to the Buddhists, and so everyone needs to listen, to have at least the opportunity to figure out these new tools to deal with dukkha. So it's not very esoteric, it's exoteric from the start.
Also, the Buddhist monks made a living by begging for food from the lay people, and so they had to convince the lay people that they had a good reason to keep the monks alive.
Yeah, exactly. If the mendicant says wise things, well, at least keeping him alive keeps a teacher alive, or something like that. So it's um, it has selfish reasons for selfish people to keep giving them alms.
Yeah, I've heard one person say that the teaching has to be good, otherwise they'll starve to death. But I think that economic incentive may actually pervert religious teachings when you can only basically teach what you can get paid to get taught, and like you have to say things that keep your community happy with what you're saying, otherwise they stop feeding you. They can have both be a decent motivation and also at times corrupt the teachings, I think. I don't know. That's
it perhaps
system.
depends on the extent in which these people have bought into virtue ethics, in which they have already some character worth of some salt. Because if their character is crappy to begin with, probably they will just buy into perverting their teachings to say things that are outrageous and people will want to hear, no matter what the cost, without any scruples. So yeah, I think it would depend on where their character was at.
Yeah, I was going to say the problem is having to get it from the populace. It becomes a popularity contest, and nobody wants to hear unpopular, unpleasant truths. And if that's what you're teaching people, and that's what you're trying to teach people is truth that they don't want to hear, yeah, it's kind of tough to get them to give you money to feed on. It's much easier to pull that, the more money you have is an indication that God loves you even more. And you can give some of that extra money to me, and then God will love you even more and give you even more money. And it'll be a wonderful cycle for everyone. That sells really well with rich people. Tag.
Okay, so to give you guys an idea of what actually was written in especially the minor rock edicts, the major rock edicts, since there are 13 of them, 14 of them, I only put a short summary. So a proclamation of Devanam Priya Asoka. So how he called himself as a follower of Buddhism, a non-Sangha, a non-monastic follower of Buddhism. 2.5 years and somewhat more have passed since I am a Buddha Sakya. So he has been pilgrimaging and learning, listening, prostrating to the Buddhist monks, the wise sages of intellectual descendants of Siddhartha. A year and somewhat more has passed since I visited the Samga, and I have shown zeal. Those gods who formerly had been unmingled with men in Jambudvipa, which according to what I researched is in Kalinga, so he kind of offended the gods with his conquest, have now become mingled with them. So maybe he appeased the gods. So who knows what was going on in his mind. This object can be reached even by a lowly person who is devoted to morality. One must not think thus that only an exalted person may reach this. So it doesn't distinguish between castes. Both lower castes and kshatriyas and brahmins can improve in the doctrine of Buddhism, or level up in the doctrine of Buddhism, or whatnot. Both the lowly and the exalted must be told, if you act thus, this matter will be prosperous and of long duration, and will thus progress to one and a half. So it's like escaping from a zero-sum game. It kind of shows an abundance mentality here.
Yeah, I just would like to say that this seems to be a clear statement that there was a time when he didn't consider himself a Buddha Sakya, and at the time of writing this edict, it's been 2.5 years, which I take a wild guess and say he was older than 2.5 at the point when he wrote this. Yeah. All right, so definitely evidence of conversion as well then, yeah.
And then in Edict 2, he said this is about how he would disseminate Dharma, and not just, he wouldn't disseminate Dharma to convert people to Buddhism. He was rather, according to the other further rock edicts, very ecumenical. He would tolerate people having non-Buddhist religions. So he would say the Rajuka rural officer is to be instructed, and he will instruct the people of the countryside, assembling them with the sound of the drum. Likewise, the local chiefs. Obey mother and father, obey the teachers. So basically, filial piety version, in Indian version. Have mercy on living beings, speak the truth. These virtues of Dhamma should be followed. So it's not basically just exclusivity to Buddhism here. These things were also in other teachings, in other writings. All should honor their masters. And he would, where I put all in square brackets, he would list a bunch of professions to say all of them should honor their masters, righteous masters. So not sadistic tyrant of the masters. So within reason. In a family, relatives must treat each other with respect. This is the ancient custom, conducive to long life, and thus it must be carried out. So basically, saying really basic things, basic niceties, basic courteousness that keeps a society together, and from families falling apart, and also communities from falling apart. So this is basically the social glue that he is addressing here. And then the other one is, thus the true Dharma, O Dhamma, will be of long duration, that I feel bound to declare the following expositions of the Dharma. So the exaltation of discipline, the ideal mode of life, fears to come, the songs of the hermit, discourse of the hermit life, the questions of Upatisha, which I didn't check out what it exactly means. The sermon of Rahula. Rahula was Siddhartha's son. Remember, Rahula meant obstacle.
Obstacle,
yeah. But Rahula also converted to Buddhism and was a revered teacher in Buddhism, which was spoken by the blessed Buddha concerning falsehood. Rather, the sermon to Rahula, so the sermon of his dad to his son. Then I desire, sirs, that many groups of monks and many nuns may repeatedly listen to these expositions of the Dharma and may reflect on them. In the same way, both laymen and laywomen should act. So he didn't just direct this to monastics, also to commoners outside of the monastic life. And then, yeah, feel free to stop me at any point, because there are some edicts. And so the major rock edicts, more succinctly, so prohibiting animal slaughter, especially ritual sacrifices involving animal cruelty for no reason, bans festival gatherings and killing of animals, with an emphasis of killing of animals for rituals. I think also it probably would be a welcoming environment for vegans at the time. In Rock Edict 2, provide care for men and animals, describes about Chola, Pandya, Satyapura, and Keralputra, which are kingdoms of South India. Generosity to Brahmins, issued 12 years after Ashoka's coronation, says that Yukta, subordinate officers, and Pradesikas, district heads, along with Rajukas, rural officers, shall go to all areas of the kingdom every 5 years and spread the Dhamma policy of Ashoka. Then Rock Edict 4, Dhammagosa, conquest by Dharma, is ideal to mankind and not the Beringosa, which is conquest by force, which he went that route before. Impact of Dhamma on society, describes it. And then Edict 5, concerns about the policy towards slaves, so to treat slaves with some respect or dignity. Mentions in this Rock Edict, every human is my child. Appointment of Dhamma Hamatras is mentioned in this edict. And then Edict 6 describes king's desire to get informed about the conditions of the people constantly. It talks about welfare measures. So not kind of checking in on them like 1984 Big Brother, but to know how health is, how economics is going throughout the kingdom, more in that regard. Because the second part is talking about welfare measures to keep the people with a good quality, a minimum quality of life and living standards. Edict 7 requests tolerance for all religion. So here is the part where we kind of infer that he was ecumenical and he wasn't just hitting everyone in the head with Buddhism or bust or something like that. Some people nowadays kind of do that things especially in the Brahmanic traditions. Don't do that. Edict describes Ashoka's Dhamma Yatra to Bodh Gaya, also known as Sambodhi, which is visit to the Bodhi tree where the Buddha supposedly reached enlightenment and built a temple there. Edict 9 condemns popular ceremonies, probably ceremonies involving something that is not in accordance with Dharma for some reason. I couldn't ascertain the details. I got this from lectures on Indian history. Emphasizes importance of ceremonies of Dhamma. So kind of contrasting here. These ceremonies are not conducive to Dharma. These are conducive to Dharma. Then condemns the desire for fame and glory. So kind of delving into the virtue ethics, which, mind you, virtue ethics was big in other parts of the known world, in the Hellenistic world as well. Emphasizes importance of popularity of Dhamma. So virtue ethics and duty ethics in parallel. And then the Edict 11 describes Dhamma. So I didn't go into this, and I think it would be a worthwhile pursuit to figure out if he literally just copy-pasted Dhamma according to Siddhartha, or if he put a twist on it. So I think it's a nice place for further studies of who wants to figure things out in terms of the early Buddhism, how it compares to the Pali Canon and whatnot. So it's a possibility for further study. 12, request for tolerance among different religious sects. So again, repeating the ecumenical policy. 13, so this one tells the story of his bloody victory that went with a huge cost for both sides in terms of lives. Also, this was really surprising for me. It describes victory of Ashoka's Dhamma, not by force, but by reason, over Greek kings Antiochus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas, Alexander, II of Ephesus, of Erebus, not Alexander the Great, and Cholas, Pandias, etc. So, which is the largest edict? It mentions other places, and so this edict is really, really interesting because it mentions interaction between his kingdom and the post-Alexandrian kingdoms. And then 14 describes engraving of inscriptions in different parts of the empire. So basically, maybe a summary or an index of sorts. And so there are influences of Ashoka's policies even nowadays. So this is on the flag of the Indian Republic. And each of the spokes represents virtue according to these. This probably delves into what Ashoka described in his description of Dhamma. Probably mentions these virtues, because this is the Ashoka Dhamma. So it's the Dharma chakra that represents the 24 qualities defined by the Buddha in his sermons. So although this is not exactly the wheel of the Eightfold Path, it's a wheel that represents the qualities or virtues. And then there's the other symbol, which is the Ashoka's capital with the 4 lions, which represents, each lion represents power, courage, pride, and confidence, which are seated on a circular abacus, also decorated with the Ashoka chakra. And so, as I mentioned, the supposed influence of Ashoka to these other kingdoms, Greek of the Greek world, where while Ashoka was working on his edicts in the Hellenistic world, we were seeing a flourishing of philosophy as well. Of course, influenced by figures like Socrates, but with notoriously similar to Buddhism kinds of approaches to life, like the Stoics, the Skeptics, the Epicureans, and so, yeah, I thought it was really, really interesting how, although we cannot know for sure, we are never sure, these are really interesting pieces of evidence that there was dialogue and interchange of ideas. So yeah, I'll let you guys ask questions or disagree with me or whatnot.
Yeah, so a couple of questions. I think earlier, before we started the stream, you talked about Ashoka sending emissaries to parts of the Greek world. So it would make sense that some of the Indian ideas actually went from India via emissaries to the Greek-speaking world. I'm also quite curious about Ashoka's version of Dharma and the Pali Canon version of Dharma. It's interesting to me that none of the articles I looked up on the oldest Buddhist text mentioned any of Ashoka's edicts, and so it would be interesting to compare his edicts and his version of Buddhism with the texts that are listed as the oldest Buddhist texts, which are significantly younger actually. Than that. Yeah, that's.
Ashoka had such a role in disseminating Buddhism with the emissaries that he sent, not just to the west, but to the east as well, that would cross the Himalayas to China and take Buddhism to China. And it's possible that if it were not for Ashoka, there would be no Zen Buddhism nowadays to speak about, because he really was really investing a lot in resources to send emissaries and Buddhist missionaries all over the place.
Yeah, but also I get the sense that he used Dhamma the word Dhamma in a way that was closer to Chanakya's use of the term and less similar to the Buddha's term. So, and even in the edict where he says he converted to lay Buddhism, it wasn't for a very long time, for about 2 years. So it's difficult to say how much he was influenced. So perhaps differences in his teachings and Buddhist teachings were great enough, and maybe that's part of the reason why like modern encyclopedia articles don't list his teachings or his edicts as Buddhist texts, because the discrepancies may be too large. Or it could be that the Pali Canon is much less closer to the historical Siddhartha. So, like, one of the possibilities that's at least in my head, and this could be completely incorrect, is that you say the edicts. Actually, Adamson says that too. It's not just you, Rogério. Say that the edicts were only translated about 200 years ago, and some of the oldest Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon texts, go back way longer than that. I think 1,000 years or so. The oldest surviving texts, and they were written down for the first time hundreds of years after Ashoka. But so at least in the Theravada tradition, the Pali Canon is considered to be authoritative, original, authentic Buddha word. And then there are some other traditions, the Mahayana tradition that's had their canon settled a little later, that includes a bunch of things that the Theravadan school doesn't consider as authentic Buddha words. And of course, there's some other schools and later schools that also added stuff that the Theravadins wouldn't consider authentic. But it is possible that even at the point where the Pali Canon was settled, there was already a bunch of things added that weren't truly authentic. And maybe the even older edicts of Ashoka were closer to what the Buddha taught. He was closer in time to the Buddha. But yeah, he wasn't a Brahmin, and so he wasn't the enlightened one, and he wasn't authorized to declare what was Buddhism and what wasn't Buddhism, at least according to the tradition of the Theravadins. So, yeah, those are some thoughts occurred to me.
Yeah.
I was going to say two things that jumped out at me here. Is one of them is that he seems very much in the mold of Cyrus the Great, where he's trying to create a new almost federal level of government where he's not governing the individual people and provinces. He's more or less governing their governors, the satrapies of the Persian Empire and such. Seems to be adopting that there. And the other one is, I do know that there was a long-standing, well-established Buddhist enclave in Alexandria that was, probably, I believe, was a product of Ashoka as well. Going to tag on those two.
That's quite interesting. And so, yeah, I added him. This is a slide that I made much before, that I shared online. And this was when I learned about Ashoka, especially before I learned about his cruelty before conversion. And so, yeah, I put him in the Philosopher Kings club. And H.G. Wells also commented on Ashoka. This is the last slide, and he said, Ashoka shines and shines brightly like a bright star even unto this day. Among the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that crown the columns of history, the name of Ashoka shines and shines almost alone a star. From the Volga to Japan, his name is still honored. So I thought that was also a really interesting Western view on Ashoka. Probably during H.G. Wells' time, they were discovering how to read the edicts. Everyone was probably quite surprised and excited, and the Buddhists were like, We were sitting on this all these years, and this directly relates to our doctrine, and we didn't know.
Something that would be also interesting to me is a little history of the Buddhist legends of Ashoka, like if there would be written records. So Adamson just kind of shares, according to legend, like a Buddhist legend, Ashoka slaughtered his brothers and his harem and created torture chambers or whatever. But he doesn't cite any sources or like when they date from. Like, how old are these legends? Are they primarily Zen Buddhist legends? Are they primarily Tibetan Buddhist legends? Are they primarily, like where do these legends come from? How or when do they date to? I think those are interesting questions.
They have kind of correlates in other histories and other geographies. Cleopatra was notorious for killing siblings to stay in or acquire power or stay in power. So it's not the the first one, but 99 brothers. That's a lot. But it's also a number that would occur because his ancestors had huge harems, just like Solomon. So
yeah,
I do know. Oh, go ahead.
But he may not have been much more cruel than other rulers, so there may not be. Well, at least from what I know, there may not be all that much ground to call him the cruel and the terrible, other than he conquered using military force, which is par for the course for emperors. And then to turn around and say, all right, I've conquered the amount of land that I want by force, and from here on, I'm going to try to
yes,
to maintain the land by dharma instead of by force, and then also to have that fall apart right after he dies, and sort of failing ruling the land by dharma.
It's important to mention one thing. That's Jaugada, which was the place where the Kalinga kingdom capital was a hugely economically important trade port that traded to islands in Indonesia and other places of the Southeast nations. And he probably wanted in this economic boon that was being experienced by this kingdom. So as soon as he gets it, it's also kind of feeling a remorse or something like that. But he got it, so afterwards it's kind of difficult to ascribe that he became a saint. So yeah, it's kind of hard.
I was going to say, I'm not sure any of those rulers that, we'll find out if you dig deep enough below the surface. They did some really ugly things, because you almost have to do when you're that level.
Yeah.
Just kind of sort of goes with the territory. And yeah, I'm not shocked about that, but, disappointed more than shocked.
Yeah.
Tag.
One kind of wonders if people like Alexander the Great or Hitler wouldn't have died so young, would they realize what they were doing and kind of stop on moral grounds, not just because they got what they wanted, or or would they continue to do this kind of genocidal, underhanded way of life, like Stalin did until he died practically of old age? So yeah, it's it's hard to especially after such a long time and sparse evidence to judge their character. It's quite hard to figure these things out.
Yeah, one thing is certain. I'm never going to make any kind of good emperor unless I start being way more friendly to Buddhists, apparently.
But probably you should really be careful with which kind of Buddhists you befriend. Just like if you befriend Christians or Muslims or Taoists or etc., there are virtuous people that are really upstanding characters there. And then there are people who are kind of like posers. I think that in every single tradition, there are posers, and might turn out that maybe most of them are posers. The genuine ones that are really feeling the wisdom and enacting it and putting it in practice with an intention and feeling really rewarded and fulfilled by doing that, they are probably very rare.
Yeah, I think I was going for the joke that like by trying to figure out like what's the truth, like what happened, and going sort of counter the accepted religious narrative. I'm alienating a Buddhist crowd in a way that would be poor form for an emperor who was just pretending to be pious. So I should do a better job if I wanted to be an emperor, which I don't. I should do a better job of pretending to be all pious and saying like, oh yeah, no, Ashoka definitely was horrible before Buddhists came to him, and then the magical wisdom of the Buddha totally converted him, and he became this Ashoka the Great that's so renowned and did all the best things. And if only all the emperors were converted by Buddhism. Oh, and by the way, also if only all the emperors would just let Jesus in their heart, and also by the way, if only all the emperors, would follow the word of Muhammad, and also by the way, like just if everyone could just listen to all of the religions, that would be the best. And yeah, sorry, I kind of fizzled out on that joke, but that was more or less the direction I wanted to take the joke in.
I also read very recently Thomas More's Utopia, and I'm reading the final chapters of book 2, which just describe, they don't have any narrative, any story. They just describe the different sectors of how the society works. And in one of them, it talks about religion. And Thomas More goes practically the same route as Ashoka. He says that one of the severest crimes is to disparage other traditions, other religious traditions, to attack them. Attacking other religious traditions just out of maliciousness is equivalent to treason in Thomas More's Utopia. And the very prince, which I found really interesting, would enforce this law and treat the guy like a traitor. So a bit more heavy-handed than Ashoka, to be sure, but there's this common element of you must respect other people's religions and not step on them just willy-nilly. If there is to be interaction, it should be a courteous and interaction of dialogue and mutual understanding. Even if people have very different traditions, if we go from Abrahamic to Hindu or to Taoist and Confucian, there are huge differences on the surface on what people do ritualistically and whatnot. But every single person is arguably mortal. They will live for very few years in the cosmic perspective. Everyone is able to suffer and experience joy, and this just creates, I think, a common ground for everyone, despite their culture and traditions. For the most part, we always have these outliers who are sadistic or masochists, but for the most part, people will find common ground if they I think if they try to find these kind of absolute truths that unite us all. So yeah, I have nothing more to add.
Yeah, I'm almost happy. I'm also happy. Graham, you want to say anything?
I was going to say, that was pretty much, total, pretty much agreement there. It's, I think people can find common ground as long as it doesn't cost them too much. I think that's when you get into issues, is when it starts costing. They start actually having to sacrifice to find common ground with other people. That's usually when the claws come out. But other than that, as long as it's not, taking food off somebody's table, it's usually pretty easy to find common ground with reasonable people. Now, narcissists, on the other hand, different story. Tag.
Yeah. Well, I would add, inspired by your words, Graham, that if you encounter some person from a different tradition, and there are two possible reactions: one of rejection and maybe even trying to nullify them into being absorbed in your own tradition, like some people try to proselytize others. But another reaction would be to show curiosity about their different tradition, so as to attempt to learn from their differences of perspective in different matters. And another possibility to add to that is to ask them what their favorite parts of their scripture, of their tradition are, and even encourage them to figure out things even better in their own tradition, to figure out the end of their tradition as best as possible. It's kind of like all traditions are like different mountains, and instead of just yanking a person that is midway up their mountain to your mountain to start in the base of the mountain, you just encourage them, well, climb further, see where that goes, go ahead. I'm also climbing my whatever mountain, might be philosophical, atheist, or whatever mountain, but I respect you and keep going. Tell me more about what you figure out, what you find from studying your scripture or whatnot as we go. So this is also a possibility.
Yeah, I like the image of actually different people climbing different mountains. Most often, when I hear that sentiment, it's different people climbing the same mountain from different angles. And I do think like one mountain can be approached from different angles, but I also think there are actually several different kinds of mountains. And sometimes people aren't climbing the same mountains just from different angles; they're actually climbing different mountains. I think that's important to keep in mind, because it can be tempting for people to assume that they're higher up on the only mountain around to climb, and therefore they're better than others who are climbing it in a different route. So they may think like, my route's better because I'm getting higher faster, whereas they may just be climbing a smaller mountain, and someone else may be sort of, I don't know, this kind of analogy may not make too much sense, but I think it's important to realize that people can actually be going off in quite different directions. And I quite like your sentiment that people could be encouraged, as long as we sort of keep in the back of our mind, like some of those mountains that people can climb involve people destroying our way of life. And so being encouraging of that kind of thing is not going to work out. But for the majority of people, that won't be the case. There are people sort of waging, like their religious mountain is waging a religious war that is aimed at getting rid of all the heretics, and we are heretics according to them. And so encouraging them to, like, you go ahead and do more of that.
Yeah, do more of your jihad. Do your jihad even more vehemently. Do it. Yeah.
That's going to backfire, I think.
Yeah, I it's it's safe that I was not going that direction. But I did find people who were extremists, not in a religious sense, not yet at least, online, but in a more nationalistic kind of sense. I found a kind of person that is very pro-Slav countries, pro-Slav nations, in a fascist kind of way. And I talked to this person respectfully, still the same, on Twitter. And I actually ended up asking him. So I basically channeled my inner Socrates, as one should do, especially in situations like this. I cannot tell them what to do because they are so beyond reproach, that I wouldn't even reproach them. What I did was I asked them, since you want to invade other nations, and then if you figure out people that are not right in their minds and you want to put them into concentration camps, as you've said, would you also agree wholeheartedly that other more powerful nation would invade your nation and for some reason decide that you yourself are not right of your mind and put you in internment camps? Would you agree that if you went this world, would you agree with the other side of the coin as well? So I'm kind of like figuring out, or exposing that the sophist doesn't agree with the sophist, that the extremist doesn't agree with his extremist position to the utmost end. So kind of exposing that, instead of just saying you're wrong and beating him with the righteousness stick on the head. Yeah, that never works, especially with guys that are really entrenched in a position.
Yeah, you say concentration camp, they say free, all expense paid resort. You know, just a difference of perspective. And the other one I have to say is beware of those who claim that their mountain is the only mountain to climb,
Yeah, yeah.
and they fight you and throw rocks down at you as you climb up and get close to them. Those are the ones to beware of. Tagging on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can call it a day, and hopefully next weekend we can tackle more 6 episodes, like full-grown philosophers.
We were being kitty philosophers today. Just
Yeah, today
one
was
measly episode.
yeah, yeah,
As opposed to our tyrant philosopher king Ashoka. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
exactly.
compared to Ashoka, I think I'm always just going to be in the kiddie pool. Like I don't think I'm going to ever grow the cojones to go on a massive campaign and take over a whole country and then spread religion far and wide, spread the Dharma. I don't think.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
always
but
just going to be a child compared to that.
but maybe you could spread the Dharma or your Dharma or whatever it is way more easily than kind of convincing troops to band together and conquest by force.
I was going to say, you have to admit Ashoka did things on a grand scale. You know, you go out there, commit genocide, then you feel bad about genocide and reform and go the other direction. You know,
Yeah,
definitely swinging the pendulum both sides.
yeah.
Yeah. All right, then, guys. I think I'll play the goodbye song. Thanks for the discussion. It was interesting. See you next week.
Bye.